I am so thrilled to be able to welcome today Helen Sutherland and Corinne Julius. They are coming to us, both of them from England and Scotland, from the British Isles. And I'm going to just quickly do a little introduction for Karlyn. We're going to be talking mostly about Karlyn's work, so I'm only going to give you the briefest of backgrounds. Karlyn, and that would be Dr. Karlyn Sutherland to you, holds a PhD in architecture from the University of Edinburgh, which she received in 2014. Her work has been the subject of a 2018 show at the Toyama Museum of Glass Art in Toyama, Japan, and has been included in exhibitions internationally, among them the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh and the Bornholm Art Museum in Bornholm, Denmark. Karlyn also is the recipient of the 32nd Reykau Commission from the Corning Museum of Glass in 2017, and the winner of the 2019 Craft Scotland Prize for Design and Craftsmanship. Her work is in the collection of the Corning Museum, courtesy of the Reykau Commission. Next month, on May 29th, Karlyn will be part of the Tallinn Applied Art Triennial, which is curated by Stina Bidstrup, another artist whose work we also represent and who some of you may know. Karlyn will also be this fall part of the European Glass Context exhibition, which will open on September 11th in Bornholm. It's the Biennial for Contemporary European Glass and Ceramics in Bornholm, Denmark. Karlyn has also recently been appointed as an adjunct professor in the MFA program at Alberta University of the Arts in Calgary. Congratulations. And today, most importantly, we are opening her exhibition, Poetry of Place, which features just a handful of really spectacular pieces, including two tables that are part of her emerging design efforts, and we will hear a little bit more about that. And to talk to Karlyn today and to all of us, I am really pleased to welcome Corinne Julius. Hello, Corinne. Corinne is the curator, writer, broadcast journalist, and is a leading champion of new design talent in the United Kingdom. Corinne grew up in a family that pioneered and revolutionized contemporary British furniture design through the family's firm, Hilly Furniture. I will do a little bit more, but if you want to really listen to more about Corinne, and Corinne would be worth a whole conversation on her own and her family history. But there's a fantastic podcast in the Material Matters series or podcast series run by Grant Gibson. Corinne has been a judge of many applied arts and design awards. She's an astute and passionate critic of contemporary craft and a mentor to contemporary designers and craftspeople. She writes regularly for a number of publications, including the Evening Standard's Home and Property, Crafts Magazine, is a reviewer for Country Life, and BBC Radio 4's Front Row. In 2008, she was made an honorary fellow of the Royal College of Art, and she is perhaps best known for conceiving of, advocating, and launching in 2014 Future Heritage, a groundbreaking incubator and showcase of contemporary craft, which is the highlight of the design trade show Decorex International. Last December, in a feature for the online magazine, The Design Edit, a feature that was called What I Want for Christmas, Corinne named a piece of Karlyn's as her object of desire. So clearly she is a fan. I'm thrilled that she is with us today to talk about and with Karlyn. So welcome everyone, welcome Karlyn and Corinne, and I will turn this over to Corinne now, who will share her screen and let us know a little bit about her own history.
Yeah, well, hello everybody. It's nighttime here in the UK, and I'm glad it's sunny and lovely where you are. We're about to have Easter weekend, which will be blowy, and then it's going to snow next week, and it's certainly going to snow where Karlyn is. So we're making the most of your warm reception. So thank you very much for inviting me to talk to Karlyn, which I do quite regularly anyway. And as you can see, all I want for Christmas, I did get one of the pieces for Christmas. It's behind me. So
you should all take our wishes like that.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm a journalist and a critic and curator, as you've already said. and I'm chair of the UK Critics Circle, their Visual Arts and Architecture section. But I suppose what gives me some of the most pleasure is being the curator. Though I hesitate, there are several curators I know in the audience, and they may not conceive of me as a curator, but it's what I do as well. And it's very similar in many ways to journalism. So I just tell you very briefly about a couple of the shows that I've curated to give it some context and to give you the context in which I've got to know Karlyn. The first one, this is the V&A, as you can see. And whoops, I seem to have gone too far. This is a show I curated in 2016 called Silver Speaks Idea to Object. And the idea of this show was, when I'm a journalist, I'm very lucky. I go to people's workshops and studios and talk to them. And in a way, I see inside the makers' heads. I get to have a slice of their brain, and I find out not just the finished object, but how that finished object, how they arrived at that, where the idea came from. I'm not going to use the word inspiration, but how they get their ideas and how they develop them. And the idea of this particular show was to demonstrate that to the general public by giving within each person a few objects which had helped them on their way. And so we showed paper sculptures, metal sculptures, drawings, odds and sods that had actually got them to the position of the final object. Clearly in the V&A, there wasn't a lot of room. And originally they wanted me to display it on their horrible pink old ladies knicker elastic shelving. And I insisted that we get proper designed shelves for that, which they were a bit confused by. So that was part of what I did. And these are just a couple of examples of things. One of the things that I'm very clear about is that I want designers, not necessarily, and makers, not necessarily young, people who are at certain points in their careers, sometimes they've got stuck, or somebody like this is Juliet Bigley, to start making and develop themselves. She'd had a number of careers and got to silversmithing and did this work especially for the show. This is another piece by a Scottish designer called Hazelthorne. There seem to be an awful lot of Scots in whatever I do. And when Scotland becomes independent, I'm going to ask for citizenship. Are you hearing me, Karlyn and Sarah up there? The next show I'd like to show you is called Blooming Jewels. This was in 2017 at Contemporary Applied Arts. This show came about because I am a jewelryaholic. I will admit to that. And if you look closely later on, you'll see I am wearing some jewelry. But in the 70s, studio jewelers got very excited about questioning value and the notion of preciousness. And in the process, they decided that the floral was decidedly not precious because it was just pretty, and they didn't want to investigate it. And it seemed to me that after 45 years, maybe they could take a new creative look. So I persuaded 23 makers to make pieces to look again at the floral, and they were very different. The media were paper, plastic, metal, all kinds of things. And within the show, what I tried to do, we didn't have a huge budget, was that I took all the jewelers to the Museum of London, and they looked at some of the work, some of the historical work in the Museum of London, particularly the en tremblant jewelry, which I'm particularly keen on. Works, which was great for the curators of the museum because they had all these jewelers looking at things and said, gosh, this is made this way. Oh, look how it's made, which they hadn't known before. And the jewelers had a wonderful time looking at historic pieces. We also ran a couple of lectures on the what had happened in floral, the decorative arts because of the floral. So this is a piece of work, came out of one of the lectures on the four noblemen of China, and it's a piece, four noble gentlemen of China, and it's four separate brooches by Anna Gordon, another Scot, and it's looking at the four noble gentlemen who are all represented by different plants. This is bamboo, and this is plum blossom. And I'm delighted to say that the pieces that were in the show were bought by the V&A for their new museum in Dundee. This is another piece by another Scot, Jonathan Boyd, who's now head of the RCA, Jewellery and Metalwork, but he's originally from Glasgow. And what he did was looked at the bottom line here is the detritus that you see around the streets of Glasgow, old sun, bits of old carpet and lino and things like that. And he made 3 brooches, which I'm very pleased to say the Goldsmiths Company bought for their collection. And this is to show that there were very different kinds of jewellery. This is all 3D printed work by a girl called Rebecca Wilkes, who was a new student. And all of those are magnetic and can be put on as you wish at your will. But I think probably the thing that I enjoy curating most is this show Future Heritage at Decorex. Decorex is an international show for interior designers and architects. 9 years ago now, I had a conversation with the then brand director. It was in Milan, very late at night at the furniture fair, and I hadn't eaten all day and I was feeling particularly bad-tempered. And she said to me, "What do you think of my show?" And I said, "Would you like the polite or would you like the truthful answer?" And she, being a New Zealander who liked the truth, said, "Well, tell me the truth." So I then went into a 15-minute diatribe about how things were beautifully made in her show as reproductions of the 18th century, but why the hell wasn't she showing what contemporary makers could do and how contemporary makers could add to her visitors' projects? And I shut up after 15 minutes and we had dinner, and I didn't see her for 9 months. And after 9 months, we had breakfast and I said, "So you didn't like my idea?" And she said, "No, I did." And I said, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" She said, "What are you going to do about it? I'm giving you the central area, do something." And I won't tell you what I actually said because it's not really printable. And then I had to do it. So I've been doing it. Before this, it was in Scion Park. But this last year, this was in Olympia, which is a very beautiful building with extraordinary light. And what I try to do is choose people who I think can develop. You'll see a range of ceramics here. It goes across media. This is James Rigler, whose ceramic furniture is now some of it in Aberdeen Museum. You'll see as we go through people like Fernando Lapuz, he works with people in Mexico. This is Lufa. You'll see some of his other pieces. It has silver, it has metal, it has wood. You've got Celia Dowson, who's here, and I'm glad I put this slide in because Celia, you're here this evening, and Celia's work, as you can see, is extraordinarily beautiful. And previously she'd made smaller pieces, but listening to my mantra of make it bigger, she did, as you can see, and they're very, very beautiful pieces. This is another glass piece. This is by a Thai and Japanese couple, and they're using old lenses put together. And you can see in the back work by Fernando Lapuz. This is Helen Stokes, who is very interested in visual perception, and not quite the same way as Karlyn, but her work is got a lot of attention. This is 3D printed material by Lynn McFarlane, another Scot. They're very good at craft in Scotland, and this is 3D printed elements that can be put together in a different way. This Gavin's work, he's was a young student who I found and encouraged, and these are Jesmonite stools, but they're cast in mashed potato, rice pudding, and various other things to give you the different texture that they have. This was the year that Karlyn, you'll see a piece there, and if you look behind me, you'll see it again. So this was the year that Karlyn was in, and we first met in Collect in 2018, and I'd been bowled over by her architectural work, which is subtle, intelligent, and aesthetically, to me, very pleasing, and thought it had a huge potential for interiors. So I invited her to take part. You can see other people here. This is Studio Glitterer. This is carpets they produced. This is their ceramic. It's all based on weeds. This is Katrin Sprenger, who's a German maker based in Britain. Everybody has to be based in Britain. And she electroforms things. She's very interested in water and water waste. And I persuaded her that she should have a bath. and that would talk about water wastage. And in this particular instance, I found another exhibitor at Decorex who is the Queen's bath restorer. You'll be pleased to know she has one. She has a number of baths. She's very keen. And we persuaded this person. He has a collection of 150 Edwardian and Victorian baths in a field. And we went down there and we chose a bath and we borrowed it, and Catherine made all the pieces for it. But you can also see at the back, there's Karlyn's work. And it's extremely beautiful. I'm intrigued by her use of optical illusion and how she plays with perception. And the pictures don't do them justice, because as you walk around them, they move, and they're very provocative in a very, very quiet way. So the piece behind me that you can see here, I walk past that, 20 times a day, and it always, I do a double take because something else happens as I walk past it. It's calming but provocative, and makes me question. Now you can see that Karlyn produces beautiful work, but she's no academic slouch, as you may have gathered from Katja's introduction. And very unusually for the craft world, she's the recipient of a Fulbright scholarship, which unfortunately is delayed because of COVID, but hopefully will take place soon. So I've talked for far too long, and I'd like you to meet Karlyn. And Karlyn, really, would you tell us a little bit of how long have you worked in glass?
Well, thank you, Katja and Corinne, for such great introductions, and also to Katja and everybody at Heller for the invitation to be part of the series of conversations, and also for the opportunity to have a focus show in the gallery. I'm very excited, and I wish I could be there in person, but hopefully before too long. So I took my first glass class in 2009. I was a year into my PhD. My research was focused on the relationships that people have with place. I'm interested in how and to what they become attached, and what architects could learn from environmental psychology in order to create spaces that encourage meaningful bonds, which I don't think there's enough of that goes on in contemporary architecture. So a lot of the texts around that look at the relationship people have with their homes. So I began to think about my relationship with my home. The village that I come from is called Leicester. It's in the North Highlands of Scotland. I know that some of you have been there. In fact, I think a good handful of you have been there. It's home to Northlands Creative, formerly Northlands Creative Glass, a glass school. Well, there's Leicester, there's where we are, edge of the world. And it's home to Northlands, a glass school that's been running for 25 years. And I knew that the area had had a big impact on a lot of the artists who had visited, and some of them had come back time and time again. So I signed up for a class, which happened to be led by Jane Bruce and Bruno Romanelli. I wanted to see what was so special about this place that I thought I knew. And I was quite, I suppose I kind of had my doubts. I had my reservations about it, but obviously I was wrong. And the rest is history, I suppose.
I mean, in a way, your work is quite autobiographical. And so tell us a little bit about your background. And I will just say that for those of us who live in the southern part of the UK, Leicester is, we would say it's falling off the top of the UK. So it's quite a different environment than for most of the rest of the country.
Yes, yeah. So this is Livestream Harbour. This is, I'm very fortunate to have this view at the moment. I've spent lockdown back in my family home with my parents. So this is Livestream Harbour. I was born and grew up in Caithness. I studied architecture in Edinburgh, and I don't think it's until I moved to the city that I began to realise the influence that the far north of Scotland had on me. Like, I think when I left, I was just quite keen just to get out, and I never really thought I'd be back, and I never really looked over my shoulder for a long time. But I think the influence is, for me, is really about the quality of the light.
I mean, I think that's interesting, but I mean, I think it's also that you, in your childhood, you've spent a lot of time observing, it seems to me. You've looked at things. You say you didn't know about it, and you hadn't thought about it originally, but in your childhood, did you make a lot? Did you observe a lot? Because you're a very observant person.
Yeah, I did make a lot. Yeah, I was always making and drawing and reading, and I enjoyed, I suppose, getting lost in and absorbed into other worlds, other people's worlds, whether that was something that was created in books or whether it was through getting to see for myself where other people lived and how they lived. I was quite curious about that in a way, but not in the sense that I was nosy, but although, you know, no more than the next person, I suppose. But it was more of a thoughtfulness, I think. I was, I think, an observer. My mum says I was always an observer, even when I was really like before I talked, I would just watch everything. So I suppose there is a lot of that still goes on. Yeah. I like to think about the details. I suppose I was quite focused and precise on whatever I was up to.
Nothing's changed. I seem to remember, though, that you said to me that your mother said your drawings were very meticulous and detailed. All that precision and accuracy is often very useful in architecture. And your glasswork seems to have that kind of influence. I mean, how deep is the architectural influence in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is definitely the primary influence in my work, and I didn't set out to do that. I mean, I didn't actually set out. I went to Northlands and took that class with the intention of kind of understanding, to watch other people making rather than really to be absorbed in it myself. But I have made a lot of work about my own relationship with place over the years, really as a way to understand that, and it is through first-hand experience. So this image that I'm showing just now is of a chambered cairn, which is not that far from Leipzig. Nobody really knows for sure what they were used for, but it is kind of assumed that they were used for burial rituals. And this actually was the first piece that I made. And the reason I show it is because I was really kind of in denial for a really long time that I was making work that was about architecture. Like, I didn't see it because it wasn't about the physical building, I suppose. So this piece of work was about the entryway into the chamber in this cairn. And it's interesting to me to look back on it now because it is very clearly about perspective and atmosphere and everything that is so integral to my work now. But you know, it wasn't, like I said, it was never really kind of part of a plan. And then once I graduated in 2014, things kind of shifted and I didn't have the same academic focus and analysis on everything that I was doing. And I found that just as in a kind of a natural evolution without planning, this work became more personal and more about my own personal relationships with places rather than things that were about a broader cultural history and not perhaps something that I had such a direct narrative with. And domestic spaces have become very kind of something that I'm just really drawn to. I think I am interested just in the everyday, in my own environment, but also everybody else's every day.
Did you, I mean, I was interested, did you kind of fall in love with glass at that point?
Oh yeah, completely. I mean, I remember and I'd come home, I was in Edinburgh at the time when I came home for the summer and my parents were away. So I think it was like a 10-day class, and on the second day, Jane Bruce, who I had only just met a couple of days before, she says, "Oh, you're really quiet, are you okay?" And I said to her and Bruno, I was like, "I think I've made a really terrible mistake. Like, I think that maybe I shouldn't be doing architecture." And of course, when I went home and said this to my family when they came home from holiday, everybody was horrified. But actually, I had just really missed making, and working with glass gave me a way to speak about atmosphere and light and those intangible things that I could never model out of anything, you know, any other kind of architectural model that I made. So it took me a long time to realize that. So yeah, I was completely hooked.
I mean, it's interesting because you talk a lot about atmosphere and you seem to me to be preoccupied with four major areas. You talk about, I mean, they're all interlinked. You talk about atmosphere, you talk about light stroke windows and time and place. And they're quite sort of broad things. Can you kind of define that a bit more and explain what you mean by that?
Sure. they are definitely linked. It is hard to separate them out. But to me, atmosphere is the character, or the mood or the feeling of a place or a situation. It's that kind of sensory or emotional impression that you're left with. And our perception of atmosphere is something that is unique to every individual. And there's also a lot of social and personal factors that come into that, but there's also a large part of it is informed by our environment, which, whether architects can have an influence over that is something that I'm really interested in.
Karlyn, where is the place that you are showing in this photograph?
So this is the next series of images that I'm going to show are an installation that I did in a barn, not that far away from here, in a place called Lathering. So
this is going to illustrate the question that I asked you, isn't it?
Yes.
In a way.
Hopefully. So what I was interested in here was in mapping the movement of the light. So if I was in this space and the sun happened to be out, I had chalk, so I would trace, and you can see just in the kind of upper left corner, you can start to see where I've begun to trace. So I would trace the form of the light, and I would also write on the wall the date and the time. And so atmosphere for me is really linked really heavily with place, in the sense that they're kind of intangible, ephemeral things. And really what all my work, and in hindsight, I didn't obviously realize this perhaps at the time, but really what I am doing is giving body to things that are intangible. So this image is a shaft of light, but I'm throwing handfuls of flour into it. And as the flour settles through the air where the light is passing.
How did you get the idea of flour?
Well, I knew that I kind of wanted to make it more visible. And I suppose I had kind of thoughts about dust, and I had come home and talked about it. This was another summer. I'd come home from Edinburgh and I was talking about it with my dad, and he says, "Oh, you should just throw flour in front of it. My parents have this piece of cloth, a thin cotton, that in the winter we make a thing called a clootie dumpling, which is like a boiled, it's way better than what it sounds. It's a boiled fruitcake. So just like, you take that and you put flour inside it and tie a knot." So that's what I did. I did that for quite a while, actually. There were a lot of buildings I went around and left a dusty trail. And so each of the pieces of glass then that I made, I wanted to be like slices of light, so that they were, and it wasn't, the times had no significance, it was just when the light was out. So the sun was out rather, and I'd drawn these shapes. So I hung these shapes. Now this doesn't really happen. You'll know that it's not sunny all the time in Scotland at all by any stretch of the imagination, but actually, so these pieces were designed to be fully illuminated for us for just a fleeting second on one day at one point in time each year. So they were it was kind of like a calendar in a sense, but it was a really interesting way to mark time, and also to see actually how accurate I had been in projecting the shafts of light and also in installing it in a building. But it was interesting. This was when I first started to work on a larger scale. Everything else prior to this had been quite small.
It's actually interesting if you look at that, Karlyn, looking at the patterning on that, it's very like the clouds in the image that you showed us right at the beginning.
Yeah, well, that's what the powder is, glass powder that's fused onto the surface, and it is just to mimic the gesture of my hand throwing the flour in the space.
But it actually is very like the clouds that you showed us in your early image.
Oh, yeah.
It seems to echo a Scottish sky. But what's also clear in what you do there is perspective plays a big part in your work. Does that come from your kind of architectural training?
Yes, yeah, I do. I reference architectural drawing a lot, more and more actually, and I use perspective to create optical illusions. And my pursuit of that stems from, I was really interested in kind of the impact of particular methods of architectural design or representation. And perspective drawing, which is obviously used, is pretty kind of widespread in architectural practice, gives you a view that's physically impossible to achieve. And because of that, it essentially promotes a distance and a detachment between the subject and the viewer or the maker. So to use perspective to explore a sense of detachment and unease was something that was and still is really interesting to me in my glasswork. I think partly because it's the opposite of what I would aspire to create in architectural design. The work is also a reference to the overuse of computer-generated drawings that we're so often presented with, because I think that they're very convincing, but they're also quite deceiving, and it can be very hard to tell what's real and what's not. So I like to kind of go back and forth in that area, I guess.
Are you going to tell us about this image, or in that sense? I mean, your work it's interesting because your work, in what you just showed us, there's this feeling of detachment, externality. It's not exactly impersonal, because obviously you explained that it isn't, but it doesn't feel impersonal, but it's a kind of detached observation.
Yes, and that is exactly what I intended them to be. That is, what I kind of set out to achieve. So in the first instance, because at this point I was making, and this is prior to that installation that I've just shown you, I was making objects that were small scale and sculptural. So I wasn't really making anything on the wall at this stage. And I had taken, these are pages from my sketchbook, I'd taken perspective drawings and kind of picked them apart and figured out how to make 3D models. The kind of 2 pages that are to the right hand side are nets. So kind of if you folded them together and stuck them together, they make these kind of perspective forms. This is some of the working out. It's what my brain looks like on a regular basis. And I figured a way to make these skewed forms, which if you viewed them with your own, like the right eye line, and I always displayed them at my eye line, which was quite tall, but there was a sense of that perspective. But they were so elaborate and so complex that they just weren't at a scale that really worked for me. And I spent quite a bit of time in Australia in 2016 to 17. And during that time, the perspective drawing became a way for me to think about places and domestic spaces where I had lived, but that weren't my home. So they were kind of about detachment in some way, whether that was just through the passage of time or, changing circumstances, or the disconnection that comes from jet lag, really, because I was traveling quite a lot at that point, and I really enjoyed kind of that process of arriving somewhere where you were clueless and didn't know anything or anyone, and kind of coming to, I think, and getting to know where you were. And when I came back from Australia, I kind of revisited a series of earlier, smaller studies that were about hospital environments that were, intentionally the work is devoid of colour and it is very stark to kind of communicate something of that sterile environment. And not long after that, also when I returned from Australia, I actually had out of residency at the studio at Corning Museum of Glass, and that was when I was fortunate enough to be offered the Raycar Commission. And so this piece was very much about the same thing. It's actually about the jet lag that I experienced coming back from Australia. I travelled from Canberra to Caithness all in one go just to get it out of the way. And when I woke up here, it was very out of sorts.
Well, taking that on, I mean, you discussed the what and the why. Can you tell us a little bit about the how? Well, in other words, about the process of what you do?
So I'm going to, because it's this last work that I've shown you, I'm going to discuss process in terms of this piece for the Raycar Commission, but it is different from my usual practice in the sense that I used a water jet cutter rather than cutting by hand, which is what I do 99% of the time. But essentially it is the same, but just bear in mind that it is not completely typical.
Somebody's asking, why is knowledge of environmental psychology important for architectural design in your own work?
Well, I think it's a good question. It's a completely different, it's not something that was taught. I don't think it's taught that commonly in architectural education. But I think it's something that we would benefit quite a lot from. And I just think the scientific study, rather than being based on, because I mean, the other school, I suppose, that complements that is phenomenology, which there is obviously a lot of worth and a lot of history around too, but people are talking about place from an entirely personal perspective. And I like I like science, like I like hard facts. And I don't really want to, when I'm designing buildings, to just be projecting. I like to kind of base it on something I suppose I know is about other people and not just about myself. So it is about something that's proven, I think.
You're going to go back to process now.
So this is the corner of my parents' living in the house that I'm living in at the moment. And so this piece for the commission is an abstraction of a windowsill, a window, and a picture frame, which is here. You wouldn't really tell particularly from that image. So my process begins with photos and sketching, and then I'll move from, once I've kind of found a rough composition that appeals to me, I move then to the computer, because I like to, well, there's so many different layers. I have to figure out the foreground, the middle ground, and the background of these perspective drawings. So I pick them apart into layers. And I do that on the computer so that I can be as accurate, because everything has to line up quite exactly. So I measure it as close as I can and then try and cut as close as I can. And I also really like to be economical. And this is, I mean, I had to lay it out like this for the water jet cutter anyway, but I do this when I'm cutting by hand. I like to know that I can get as much as I can out of sheets, and that I'm not going to plow through a lot of material and be left with a lot of odd sheets. So then this is the water jet cutting. And the beauty of being able to have parts of water jet cut was that I could make these really thin lines so that you can't see the depth of that, but it's 6 millimeters deep and it tapers to 2 millimeters there at the end. So I was able to make these really fine lines.
But otherwise you're grinding by hand, aren't you? You're doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, you can't, well, I can't anyway cut. So then there's a lot of back and forth between the process because it goes into the kiln face side down. So there is a lot of, you know, back and forth, and I have to be really mindful that things go in the right way, because it's very easy to put things in but looks the right way but it's actually upside down. Thankfully I've only done that once, because I think it's the sort of thing you only do once. And this is then assembling it in the kiln face side down, and then once it comes out the kiln. And then from there I do most of my finishing by hand, although I have recently started using a grinder. I bought a grinder in November, which was a game changer, because prior to that everything was done by hand, which I enjoyed. But
it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you do, your surfaces are matte, and you tend to use a rather kind of muted palette. Would you say that that reflects your muted color palette? I think you might dispute whether it's muted. I think it's muted. Whether that reflects your whole involvement in detachment, if you can be involved in detachment.
But I know I do dispute it. I don't think that, not anymore. I think that, I mean, the detachment in my palette previously was intentional. But I don't consider it to be so now. You know, I do try to capture something of the tones of the light that I'm talking about, the places that I am making about. And so the next series of images were taken at Pilchuck, an emerging artist in residence there in the winter or the autumn of 2019. So I'm really interested in the colours of the sky and the qualities and tones of light at different times of day. And also in the foliage. We don't really have much foliage here on the coast. Everything gets burnt by the salt, so nothing really grows. So yeah, I'm trying to communicate something of a subtlety. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do with that pink.
I mean, you've gone away from those greys into blues.
Yes, yeah.
Quite a lot. But going back to place, and you were talking about place, you use place in your titles, don't you?
Oh, well, with the exception of kind of work that came later that was more design-led, you know, it started out as just a way to, I mean, I'm quite matter-of-fact, I suppose, so it was just calling it what it was, you know, I named them just after the places that I made them about. And actually, I mean, I know that sometimes it can maybe, you know, from the outside seem maybe a little bit dry, but it actually works really well for me because I don't really have to think about it. I don't have to be thumbing through the thesaurus trying to find, you know, another word for light. So yeah, I suppose I just call it like I see it.
Well, this is another area which I really wanted to explore a little bit, and this is one of your newest pieces. And it obviously demonstrates very clearly the importance of optical illusion in your work.
It is. It's something that's been really pivotal over the last few years. I mean, I see it a little bit differently now. I think I have a different approach. But it's a good metaphor for what I am interested in, and a good vehicle, I think, to be able to explore it. And I do, you know, I like to make work that are about spaces and volumes that you can't reach. And so I suppose to communicate folding and movement where there is none, but to do it in a way that's not too kind of visually busy or overwhelming. So it's about, for me, trying to make something that's visually rich, but with as few elements as possible, which is a real challenge, but that's also part of why I like it.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, are you principally making to express your own ideas? But does the way that other people understand or interpret your work bother you? Because I mean, for architects, very often get upset about how people interpret their work or what they do to you or what their work. Does that kind of hang over with you?
No, not at all, actually. I don't mind at all. I actually enjoy the wide range of responses. But I do, unless it's a commission or it's a functional piece of work, I do try to make for myself and not to be too coloured by kind of trends or expectation. But I do enjoy the responses. And it's interesting to make work that is about a particular place and then to see it somewhere else, whether it's in, a gallery set in. But then also, and obviously this is the piece that's behind you, then to see pieces that are in people's homes and to see how they live with them. And I suppose then the associations that are built that way rather than it just being about me.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I live with it every day and I enjoy it enormously. Otherwise, I wouldn't be talking to you now, really. I think it's, it's something, I see something different in it. It doesn't show it so well when it's a static thing. I think that's one of the very difficult things about your work. And so those line pieces you have can often look like a render. And actually this to people might look like a render, but it isn't. And as you move around, you see it and different things happen. And it's just that very slight changing of perspective, which is disconcerting. Because you say your work's calming, but I think it is calm, but it is also disconcerting. And to me, that's quite provocative. And I wondered how intentional that is.
Well, it's interesting because obviously I have a very different relationship with it. And by the time I finish making it, I find it very difficult to stand back often and see and to know the kind of the true impact. But I try, I make work that's about quiet moments, really. I feel like I spend a lot of time trying to find quiet moments, especially in this last year. And like I said, I'm never really sure how other people see them. And I do quite often have to live with a piece or an idea for a little while before I can stand back, I think. But I do, with the design work, I've started to, I suppose, to dabble in furniture, I suppose. And these two tables are prototypes that I made for you for Future Heritage. And I think at that point I did really understand that it could be provocative, and that is something that I could start to harness.
And actually, we have another question that actually fits, I think, right in here from Tom Castens, which is, what role does geometry and mathematics play in your art?
A lot, yeah. I mean, I think that I am very conscious of composition and proportion and form and scale. Mathematics, not so much, maybe just in terms of practicalities, in terms of economy, I think. And I mean economy in terms of, how much I'm cutting from a sheet or how big I'm able to make pieces, because I try to avoid seams and other visual distractions in the work. But geometry, yeah, I'm definitely very hung up on geometry.
I mean, these pieces were really interesting in that they were, I think this, if you wanted to cure people of drinking, you would put a drink on here, because when you look at it, they are so disconcerting and they don't look like they can stand up, and they certainly don't look like they can support a drink. I mean, they worked, but that was really interesting, and to watch people's reactions as they came round and looked at your tables. Some people really just freaked out, didn't they?
Yeah, I would go as far as to say horrified. He was not on board.
Which I thought was hilarious. In that sense, because I did push you really on these interior pieces. I mean, how far are you going to pursue that, do you think?
Well, yeah, no, I am pursuing it. I think that, like I said, it took me a while. I mean, architects kind of historically that have tried to make furniture haven't always really done it that well. And I was quite conscious of that.
Can we just say they've never done it that well?
Yeah, there were a few.
Well, when they're trying to make pieces that are comfortable, come on. No, they don't.
Yeah, well, I'm not making things that are comfortable. I mean, there's nothing, no, they're not comfortable. I think there's probably a reasonable amount of discomfort in the viewing of them, which is part of the fun. But yeah, the interior work has been evolving, and the pandemic has kind of put the brakes on that. But it is, I've been doing quite a lot of sketching and some model making, and I am very much ready to get back into making functional work.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when you've talked about your work, you've talked about it about being about personal atmospheres, memories, and spaces. So how do you feel, because this kind of work is often going to be a response, but it's a site-specific work for commissioners. How do you think that's going to work? Are you happy to do that?
Yeah, actually that's probably in a lot of ways where I'm more comfortable. I trained as a designer to design for other people, to parameters and briefs, and to the needs of other people rather than just thinking solely about myself. And plus I'm Scottish, so I don't really like to talk about myself all that much all the time anyway. So to design for function rather than just solely decoration is definitely something that is second nature. So yeah, the door is definitely open for more of that type of work in the future.
Well, I'm looking forward to actually finding out what that's going to be. But Karlyn, it's been a joy talking to you, even if you didn't enjoy talking about yourself. We enjoyed hearing about you. And I'm sure there's a lot more that Vicky said, but I think, Katja, you might have some questions from the audience.
We do have, so one question here is, again, from Tom, which is if the tables are actually flat. So I will say that the illusion works. So could we go back to a couple of the images, Karlyn?
Yeah, no, they are. I mean, you see it more so in these where I'm using the sheet glass to define the planes. You can tell these are flat. But yeah, no, it is part of the illusion. But I think this is the image really that does kind of put the cat amongst the pigeons. So they are completely flat. The tops are 9 millimeters thick, and they're a uniform thickness. They're fused thin slabs. There's no tapering. They're completely level.
I mean, I'm absolutely serious. I do think that if people got a drink problem, that actually using your tables would just stop them drinking, because frankly, they really freak you out, but they're wonderful.
Maybe that's my marketing angle going forwards.
But here's the wine glass on the table.
And this is whiskey on this one. So
whiskey there. There you go.
Scotland after all.
And have you considered, the other question is, have you considered benches?
Yes, yeah. I mean, really, I was starting small with the tables. I think it was a more manageable scale because I could model these. I could make them out of something that wasn't glass, just to kind of get my bearings a little bit. But having made them and lived with the idea and also seen the work in the flesh, I definitely now I'm at the stage where I'm thinking of larger.
I mean, when we were originally talking, I was trying to push you to making screens and you refused.
You're still trying to push me to make screens and I'm still refusing.
But you made the tables, and I think that actually they've had a lot of interest. And I can see your work in interiors as a sort of structural element. I just think there haven't been that many interior designers yet who've understood what you could do.
And there are follow-up questions actually on the tables here. And I do agree with you, Corinne, that I think that, the kind of the interface with this space might be very interesting just to see, but I would like to have Karlyn tell us if that's where she's heading. But there's a question about whether you would make benches and whether you could make them. Would you build your furniture to be weather resistant so that, for instance, the benches can be situated within the nature you are inspired by?
Yes, it's an interesting question because I actually hadn't thought furniture that wasn't, I suppose, for indoor spaces. But yeah, I mean, I don't think that it would be an insurmountable challenge at all. I think that would be.
And here's a question from Richard Whiteley. The wall works read like portals to another imagined space. The tables seem to be distortions of our physical space. Do you see the works in the same way?
No, and it's interesting that taking something from the wall, so viewing it vertically and then turning it horizontally, what a difference that makes. And I think it maybe is to do with just how we're presented with them, whether, they're maybe just harder to deal with in a sense. And I think also because you're asking it to be functional. So to me, they are very separate. And I don't, the design work, the tables is not something that has a history of place and story with me in the same way. So they're very much related, but they're also two separate bodies of work and two separate approaches.
And then a question about the tables. There was a question about the thickness, whether they are the same thickness as your wall pieces, and also, will you use the edge of the tables to explore more reflection of light for the viewer to be able to look at the glass from a different angle?
In finishing these, they're about 360, 400 grit maximum, and that's the front face and the edges. I am interested in polishing the edges, particularly on the tables, to let more light in, because to catch the edge of those semi-translucent panels.
And there's a question about whether you consider James Turrell a mentor, an inspiration, or a nemesis.
Oh, I wish he'd be my mentor. That would be great. I love James Turrell.
And I also have a question. So when in thinking about your work, I've often thought about the idea of geometry and memory. It's and kind of a memory and a longing. It's very rare that geometry is used in any emotional way. Mm-hmm. And I think that is, to me, what really stands out about your work, is the idea that, amongst so many other things, but one of the things that really makes it so different from most of everything else that I've seen is that geometry really isn't used in an emotional way. And I think that you managed to do that.
It's interesting you say. I mean, what about Escher? I think, in a sense, sometimes Karlyn's work reminds me of Escher.
I suppose it's true. I'm sure there's other artists. I mean, James Turrell is somebody who, his work is also about geometry in many ways and about light. And it is obviously, when you enter a space of his, it is emotional. But I think that these things, your objects evoke that in a way that is really remarkable.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, they're not things that are natural partners, I don't think, but I like that juxtaposition. I suppose that contrast is interesting and where they meet.
Thank you, Corinne, so much. Thank you, Karlyn. Thank you for the work. And if any of you would like to get a little private tour of the show, we are here. The show is up and it will be up through this month and next. So please let us know. So nice to have you with us. Have a good rest of your afternoon and evening.